The water of the Earth's surface, viewed from the standpoint of Anthropo-Geography, is one, whether it appears as atmospheric moisture, spring, river, lake, brackish lagoon, enclosed sea basin, or open ocean. Its universal circulation, from the falling of the dews to the vast sweep of ocean current, causes this inviolable unity. Variations in the geographical forms of water are superficial and constantly changing. They pass into one another by almost imperceptible gradations, shift their unstable outlines at the bidding of the mobile, restless element. In contrast to the land, which is marked by diversity of geologic structure and geographic form, the world of water is everywhere approximately the same, excepting only the difference in the mineral composition of seawater as opposed to that of spring and stream. Therefore, whenever man has touched it, it has molded him in much the same way, given the same direction to his activities, dictated the use of the same implements and methods of navigation. As maritime trader or colonist, he has sailed to remote, unknown, yet familiar coasts, and found himself as much at home as on his native shores. He has built up maritime empires, the center of whose dominion, race, and commerce falls somewhere in the dividing yet uniting sea. The water a factor in man's mobility. Man must be grouped with the air and water as part of the mobile envelope of the Earth's surface. The mobility which maintains the unity of air and water has caused the unity of the human race. Abundant facilities of dispersal often give animal forms a wide or cosmopolitan distribution. Man, by appropriating the mobile forces in the air and water to increase his own powers of locomotion, has become a cosmopolitan being, and made the human race reflect the unity of atmosphere and hydrosphere. Always the eternal unrest of the moving waters has knocked at the door of human inertia to arouse the sleeper within. Always the flow of stream and the ebb of tide have sooner or later stirred the curiosity of the land-born barbarian about the unseen destination of these marching waters. Rivers by the mere force of gravity have carried him to the shores of their common ocean, and placed him on this highway of the world. Then from his sea-girt home, whether island or continent, he has timidly or involuntarily followed the track which headland-dotted coast, or ocean current, or monsoon, or trade wind marked out for him across the pathless waters, so that at the grey dawn of history he appears as a cosmopolite, occupying every part of the habitable earth. These sporadic oversea wanderings, with intervals of centuries or millenniums between, open to his occupancy strange and remote lands, in whose isolation and new environment he developed fresh variations of mind, body and cultural achievements, to arm him with new weapons in the struggle for existence. The sea which brought him bars him for a few ages from his old home, till the tradition of his coming even is lost. Then with higher nautical development, the sea loses its barrier nature, movements of people and trade recross its surface to unite those who have been long severed and much differentiated in their mutual remoteness. The ensuing friction and mingling weed out the less fit variations of each, and combine in the new race the qualities able to fortify a higher type of man. Not only seas and oceans, but also mountains and deserts serve to isolate the migrant people who once has crossed them, but wastes of water raise up the most effective barriers. Oceans and seas in universal history. The transformation of the ocean into a highway by the development of navigation is a late occurrence in the history of man and is perhaps the highest phase of his adaptation to environment, because an adaptation which has placed at his disposal that vast water area constituting 3/4 of the Earth's surface from which he had previously been excluded. Moreover, it was adaptation to an alien and hostile element, whose violent displays of power recurrently stimulated the human adjustment between attack and defense. Because adaptation to the sea has been vastly more difficult than to the land, commensurate with the harder struggle it has brought greater intellectual and material rewards. This conquest of the sea is entitled to a peculiarly high place in history, because it has contributed to the union of the various peoples of the world, has formed a significant part of the history of man, whether that history is economic, social, political, or intellectual. Hence history has always staged its most dramatic acts upon the margin of seas and oceans. Here always the plot thickens and gives promise of striking development. Rome of the 7 hills pales before England of the 7 seas. The sea in universal history. Universal history loses half its import, remains an aggregate of parts, fails to yield its significance as a whole, if it does not continually take into account the unifying factor of the seas. Indeed, no history is entitled to the name of universal unless it includes a record of human movements and activities on the ocean, side by side with those on the land. Our school textbooks in geography present a deplorable hiatus, because they fail to make a definite study of the oceans over which man explores and colonizes and trades, as well as the land on which he plants and builds and sleeps. The striking fact about the great world ocean today is the manifold relations which it has established between the dwellers on its various coasts. Marine cables, steamer and sailing routes combine to form a network of paths across the vast commons of the deep. Over these the commercial, political, intellectual, or even purely migrant activities of human life move from continent to continent. The distinctive value of the sea is that it promotes many-sided relations as opposed to the one-sided relation of the land. France on her eastern frontier comes into contact with people of kindred stock, living under similar conditions of climate and soil to her own. On her maritime border she is open to intermittent intercourse with all continents and climes and races of the world. To this sea border must be ascribed the share that France has taken in the history of North and South America, the West Indies, North and Equatorial Africa, India, China, and the South Seas. So we find the great maritime peoples of the world, from the Phoenicians to the English, each figuring in the history of the world of its day, and helping weave into a web of universal history the stories of its various parts. Origin of navigation. Man's normal contact with the sea is registered in his nautical achievements. The invention of the first primitive means of navigation, suggested by a floating log or bloated body of a dead animal, must have been an early achievement of a great many peoples who lived near the water, or who in the course of their wanderings found their progress obstructed by rivers. It belongs to a large class of similar discoveries which answer urgent and constantly recurring needs. It was, in all probability, often made and is often lost again, until a growing habit of venturing beyond shore or river bank in search of better fishing, or of using the easy open waterways through the thick tangle of a primeval forest to reach fresh hunting grounds, established it as a permanent acquisition. Primitive forms. The first devices were simply floats or rafts, made of light wood, reeds, or the hollow stems of plants woven together and often buoyed up by the inflated skins of animals. Floats of this character still survive among various peoples, especially in poorly timbered lands. The skin rafts, which for ages have been the chief means of downstream traffic on the rivers of Mesopotamia, consist of a square framework of interwoven reeds and branches, supported by the inflated skins of sheep and goats. 528 They are guided by oars and poles down or across the current. These were the primitive means by which Layard transported his winged bull from the ruins of Nineveh down to the Persian Gulf, and they were the same which he found on the bas-reliefs of the ancient capital, showing the methods of navigation 3,000 years ago. 529 Similar skin rafts serve as ferry boats on the Sutlej, Shajak, and other head streams of the industry. 530 They reappear in Africa as the only form of ferry used by the Moors on the river Morbea in Morocco, on the Nile, where the inflated skins are supplanted by earthen pots. 531 And on the Yo River of semi-arid Sudan, where the platform is made of reeds and is buoyed up by calabashes fastened beneath. 532 Primitive craft in arid lands. In treeless lands, reeds growing on the margins of streams and lakes are utilized for the construction of boats. The Buduma Islanders of Lake Chad use clumsy skiffs 18 feet long, made of hollow reeds tied into bundles and then lashed together in a way to form a slight cavity on top. 533 In the earliest period of Egyptian history, this type of boat with slight variations was used in the papyrus marshes of the Nile. 534 And it reappears as the Ambach boat which Schweinfurth observed on the upper White Nile. 535 It is in use far away among the Sayyids or fowlers, who inhabit the reed-grown rim of the Sistan Lake in arid Persia. 536 As the Peruvian balsa, it has been the regular means of water travel on Lake Titicaca since the time of the Incas, and in more primitive form it appears among the Shoshone Indians of the Snake River Valley of Idaho. who used this device in their treeless land to cross the streams, when the water was too cold for swimming. 537 Still cruder rafts of reeds, without approach to boat form, were the sole vehicles of navigation among the backward Indians of San Francisco Bay, and were the prevailing craft among the coast Indians farther south and about the Gulf of Lower California. 538 Trees abounded, but these remnant tribes of low intelligence, probably recent arrivals on the coast from the interior, equipped only with instruments of bone and stone, found the difficulty of working with wood prohibitive. The second step in the elaboration of water conveyance was made when mere flotation was succeeded by various devices to secure displacement. The evolution is obvious. The primitive raftsman of the Mesopotamian rivers wove his willow boughs and osiers into a large, round basket form, covered it with closely sewn skins to render it watertight, and in it floated with his merchandise down the swift current from Armenia to Babylon. These were the boats which Herodotus saw on the Euphrates 539 and which survive today. 540 According to Pliny, the ancient Britons used a similar craft, framed of wickerwork and covered with hide, in which they crossed the English and Irish channels to visit their kinsfolk on the opposite shores. This skin boat or coracle or curragh still survives on the rivers of Wales and the west coast of Ireland, where it is used by the fishermen and considered the safest craft for stormy weather. 541 It recalls the bullskin boat used in pioneer days on the rivers of our western plains, and the skiffs serving as passenger ferries today on the rivers of eastern Tibet. 542 It reappears among the Arikara Indians of the upper Missouri. 543 And the South American tribes of the Gran Chaco. 544 The first wooden boat was made of a tree trunk, hollowed out either by fire or axe. The wide geographical distribution of the dugout and its survival in isolated regions of highly civilized lands pointed out as one of those necessary and obvious inventions that must have been made independently in various parts of the world. Relation of the river to marine navigation. The quieter water of rivers and lakes offered the most favorable conditions for the feeble beginnings of navigation, but the step from inland to marine navigation was not always taken. The Egyptians, who had well-constructed river and marine boats, resigned their maritime commerce to Phoenicians and Greeks, probably, as has been shown, because the silted channels and swamps of the outer Nile delta held them at arm's length from the sea. Similarly, the equatorial lakes of Central Africa have proved fair schools of navigation, where the art has passed the initial stages of development. The Kingdom of Uganda on Victoria Nyanza, at the time of Stanley's visit, could muster a war fleet of 325 boats, 100 of them measuring from 50 to 70 feet in length. The largest were manned by a crew of 64 paddlers and could carry as many more fighting men. 545 The long plateau course of the mighty Congo has bred a race of river navigators, issuing from their riparian villages to attack the traveler in big flotillas of canoes ranging from 50 to 85 feet in length. The largest of them driven through the water by 80 paddlers and steered by 8 more paddles in the stern. 546 But the Congo and lake boats are barred from the coast by a series of cataracts, which mark the passage of the drainage streams down the escarpment of the plateau. Retarded navigation. There are peoples without boats or rafts of any description. Among this class are the Central Australians, Bushmen, navigation. Hottentots and Kaffirs of arid South Africa, 547 and with few exceptions also the Damaras. Even the coast members of these tribes only wade out into the shallow water on the beach to spear fish. The traveler moving northward from Cape Town through South Africa, across its few scant rivers, goes all the way to Ngami Lake before he sees anything resembling a canoe, and then only a rude dugout. Still greater is the number of people who, though inhabiting well-indented coasts, make little use of contact with the sea. Navigation, unknown to many Australian coast tribes, is limited to miserable rafts of mangrove branches on the northwest seaboard, and to imperfect bark canoes with short paddles on the south. Only in the north, where Malayan influences are apparent, does the hollow tree stem with outrigger appear. 548 This retardation is not due to fear, because the South Australian native, like the Fuegian, ventures several miles out to sea in his frail canoe. It is due to that deep-seated inertia which characterizes all primitive races, and for which the remote, outlying location of peninsular South America, Southern Africa, and Australia before the arrival of the Europeans, afforded no antidote in the form of stimulating contact with other peoples. But the Irish, who started abreast of the other northern Celts in nautical efficiency, who had advantages of proximity to other shores, and in the early centuries of their history sailed to the faraway Faroes and even to Iceland, peopled southern Scotland by an oversea emigration, made piratical descents upon the English coast, and in turn received colonies of bold Scandinavian mariners, suffered an arrested development in navigation, and failed to become a seafaring folk. Regions of advanced navigation. Turning from these regions of merely rudimentary navigation and inquiring where the highest efficiency in the art was obtained before the spread of Mediterranean and European civilization, we find that this distinction belongs to the great island world of the Pacific and to the neighboring lands of the Indian Ocean. Sailing vessels and outrigger boats of native design and construction characterize the whole sea-washed area of Indo-Malasian civilization from Malacca to the outermost isles of the Pacific. The eastern rim of Asia, also, belongs to this wide domain of nautical efficiency, and the coast Indians of southern Alaska and British Columbia may possibly represent an eastern spur of the same 549 thrown out in very remote times and maintained by the advantageous geographic conditions of that indented, mountainous coast. Adjoining this area on the north is the long-drawn Arctic seaboard of the Eskimo, who unaided have developed in their sealskin kayak and bidarka seagoing craft unsurpassed for the purposes of marine hunting and fishing, and who display a fearlessness and endurance born of long and enforced intimacy with the deep. Driven by the frozen deserts of his home to seek his food chiefly in the water, the Eskimo, nevertheless, finds his access to the sea barred for long months of winter by the jagged ice pack along the shore. Geographic conditions in Polynesia. The highest degree of intimacy is developed in that vast island-strewn stretch of the Pacific constituting Oceanica. 550 here, where a mild climate enables the boatman race to make a companion of the deep, where every landscape is a seascape, where every diplomatic visit or war campaign, every trading journey or search for new cocoa palm plantation means a voyage beyond the narrow confines of the home island. There dwells a race whose splendid chest and arm muscles were developed in the gymnasium of the sea, who, living on a paltry 515,000 square miles, 1,320,300 square kilometers, of scattered fragments of land, but roaming over an ocean area of 25 million square miles, are not more at home in their palm-wreathed islets than on the encompassing deep. Migrations, voluntary and involuntary, make up their history. Their trained sense of locality, enabling them to make voyages several hundred miles from home, has been mentioned by various explorers in Polynesia. The Marshall Islanders set down their geographical knowledge in maps which are fairly correct as to bearings but not as to distances. The Raleigh Islanders of this group make charts which include islands, routes and currents. 551 Captain Cook was impressed by the geographical knowledge of the people of the South Seas. A native Tahitian made for him a chart containing 74 islands, and gave an account of nearly 60 more. 552 Information and directions supplied by natives have aided white explorers to many discoveries in these waters. Quiros, visiting the Duff Islands in 1606, learned the location of Tikopia, one of the New Hebrides group, 300 miles away. Not only the excellent seamanship and the related pelagic fishing of the Polynesians bear the stamp of their predominant water environment, their mythology, their conception of a future state, the germs of their astronomical science, are all born of the sea. Though the people living on the uttermost boundaries of this island world are 6,000 miles, or 10,000 kilometers, apart, and might be expected to be differentiated by the isolation of their island habitats, nevertheless they all have the same fundamental characteristics of physique, language and culture from Guam to Easter Isle, reflecting in their unity the oneness of the encompassing ocean over which they circulate. 553. Mediterranean versus Atlantic seamanship. Midway between these semi-aquatic Polynesians and those Arctic tribes who are forced out upon the deep, to struggle with it rather than associate with it, we find the inhabitants of the Mediterranean islands and peninsulas, who are favored by the mild climate and the tideless, fogless, stormless character of their sea. While such a body of water invites intimacy, it does not breed a hardy or bold race of navigators. It is a nursery, scarcely a training school. Therefore, except for the far-famed Dalmatian sailors, who for centuries have faced the storms sweeping down from the Dinaric Alps over the turbulent surface of the Adriatic, Mediterranean seamanship does not command general confidence on the high seas. Therefore it is the German, English and Dutch steamship lines that are today the chief ocean carriers from Italian ports to East Africa, Asia, Australia, North and South America, despite the presence of native lines running from Genoa to Buenos Aires, Montevideo and New York, just as it was the Atlantic states of Europe, and only these and all of these, except Germany, who, trained to venture out into the fogs and storms and unmarked paths of the Mare Tenebrosum, participated in the early voyages to the Americas. One after the other they came, Norwegians, Spaniards, Portuguese, English, French, Dutch, Swedes and Danes. The anthropo-geographical principle is not invalidated by the fact that Spain and England were guided in their initial transatlantic voyages by Italian navigators, like Columbus, Cabot and Amerigo Vespucci. The long maritime experience of Italy and its commercial relations with the Orient, reaching back into ancient times, furnished abundant material for the researches and speculations of such practical theorists, but Italy's location fixed the shores of the Mediterranean as her natural horizon, narrowed her vision to its shorter radius. Her obvious interest in the preservation of the old routes to the Orient made her turn a deaf ear to plans aiming to divert European commerce to transatlantic routes. Italy's entrance upon the high seas was, therefore, reluctant and late, retarded by the necessity of outgrowing the old circumscribed outlook of the enclosed basin before adopting the wider vision of the open ocean. Venice and Genoa were crippled not only by the discovery of the sea route to India, but also by their adherence to old thalassic means and methods of navigation inadequate for the high seas. 554 However, these Mediterranean seafolk are being gradually drawn out of their seclusion, as is proved by the increase of Italian oceanic lines and the recent installation of an Hellenic steamship line between Piraeus and New York. 3 Geographic stages of maritime development. The size of a sea or ocean is a definite factor in its power to attract or repel maritime ventures, especially in the earlier stages of nautical development. A broken, indented coast means not only a longer and broader zone of contact between the inhabitants and the sea, it means also the breaking up of the adjacent expanse of water into so many alcoves, in which fisherman, trader and colonist may become at home, and prepare for maritime ventures farther afield. The enclosed or marginal sea tempts earlier because it can be compassed by coastwise navigation, then by the proximity of its opposite shores and its usual generous equipment with islands. The next step to crosswise navigation is encouraged. For the earliest stages of maritime development, only the smaller articulations of the coast and the inshore fringe of sea inlets count. This is shown in the primitive voyages of the Greeks, before they had ventured into the Euxine or west of the forbidding Cape Malea, and in the inside passage navigation of the Indians of southern Alaska, British Columbia, and Chile, who have never stretched their nautical ventures beyond the outermost rocks of their scary-walled coast. Influence of enclosed seas upon navigation. A second stage is reached when an enclosed basin is at hand to widen the maritime horizon, and when this larger field is exploited in all its commercial, colonial, and industrial possibilities, as was done by the Phoenicians and Greeks in the Mediterranean, the Hansa towns in the Baltic, the Dutch and English in the North Sea. The third and final stage is reached when the nursery of the inshore estuary or gulf and the elementary school of the enclosed basin are in turn outgrown, and the larger maritime spirit moves on to the open ocean for its field of operation. It is a significant fact that the Norse, bred to the water in their fjords and channels behind their protecting skerry wall, then trained in the stormy basins of the North and Irish seas, were naturally the first people of Europe to cross the Atlantic, because the Atlantic of their shores, narrowing like all oceans and seas toward the north, assumes almost the character of an enclosed basin. The distance from Norway to Greenland is only 1,800 miles, little more than that across the Arabian Sea between Africa and India. We trace, therefore, a certain analogy between the physical subdivisions of the world of water into inlet, marginal sea, and ocean, and the anthropo-geographical gradations in maritime development. The enclosed or marginal sea seems a necessary condition for the advance beyond coastwise navigation and the much later step to the open ocean. Continents without them, like Africa, except for its frontage upon the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, have shown no native initiative in maritime enterprise. Africa was further cursed by the mockery of desert coasts along most of her scant thalassic shores. In the Americas, we find the native races compassing a wide maritime field only in the Arctic, where the fragmentary character of the continent breaks up the ocean into Hudson's Bay, Davis Strait, Baffin Bay, Gulf of Boothia, Melville Sound and Bering Sea, and in the American Mediterranean of the Caribbean Sea and Gulf of Mexico. The excellent seamanship developed in the archipelagos of southern Alaska and Chile remained abortive for maritime expansion, despite a paucity of local resources and the spur of hunger, owing to the lack of a marginal sea. But in the Caribbean basin, the Arawaks and later the Caribs spread from the southern mainland as far as Cuba. 555, see map page 101. Enclosed seas as areas of ethnic and cultural assimilation. Enclosed or marginal seas were historically the most important sections of the ocean prior to 1492. Apart from the widening of the maritime horizon which they give to their bordering people, each has the further advantage of constituting an area of close vicinal grouping and constant interchange of cultural achievements, by which the civilization of the whole basin tends to become elevated and unified. This unification frequently extends to race also, owing to the rapidity of maritime expansion and the tendency to ethnic amalgamation characteristic of all coast regions. We recognize an area of Mediterranean civilization from the Isthmus of Suez to the sacred promontory of Portugal, and in this area a long-headed, brunette Mediterranean race, clearly unified as to stock, despite local differentiations of culture, languages and nations in the various islands, peninsulas and other segregated coastal regions of the sea. 556 The basin appears therefore as an historical whole, for in it a certain group of peoples concentrated their common efforts, which crisscrossed from shore to shore. Phoenicia's trade ranged westward to the outer coasts of Spain, and later Barcelona's maritime enterprises reached east to the Levant. Greece's commercial and colonial relations embraced the Crimea and the mouth of the Rhone, and Genoa's extended east to the Crimea again. The Saracens, on reaching the Mediterranean edge of the Arabian Peninsula, swept the southern coasts and islands, swung up the western rim of the basin to the foot of the Pyrenees, and taught the sluggish Spaniards the art of irrigation practiced on the garden slopes of Yemen. The ships of the Crusaders from Venice, Genoa, and Marseilles anchored in the ports of Mohammedanized Syria, brought the symbol of the cross back to its birthplace in Jerusalem, but carried away with them countless suggestions from the finished industries of the East. Here was give and take, expansion and counter-expansion, conquest and expulsion, altogether making up a great sum of reciprocal relations embracing the whole basin, the outcome of that close geographical connection which every sharply defined sea establishes between the coasts which it washes. North Sea and Baltic basins. The same thing has come to pass in the North Sea. Originally Celtic on its western or British side, as opposed to its eastern or Germanic coast, it has been wholly Teutonized on that flank also from the Strait of Dover to the Firth of Tay, and sprinkled with Scandinavian settlers from the Firth of Tay northward to Caithness. 557 The 11th century saw this ethnic unification achieved, and the end of the Middle Ages witnessed the diffusion of the elements of a common civilization through the agency of commerce from Bruges to Bergen. The Baltic, originally Teutonic only on its northern and western shores, has in historical times become almost wholly Teutonic, including even the seaboard of Finland and much of the coast provinces of Russia. 558 Unification of civilization attended this unification of race. In its period of greatest historical significance from the 12th to the 17th century, the Baltic played the role of a northern Mediterranean. 559 The countless shuttles of the Hansa ships wove a web of commercial intercourse between its remotest shores. Novgorod and Abio were in constant communication with Lübeck and Stralsund, 560 and Wispy, on the island of Gotland at the great crossroads of the Baltic. 561 had the focal significance of the Piraeus in ancient Aegean trade. Bering Sea. If we turn to Asia, we find that even the unfavorable Arctic location of Bering Sea has been unable to rob it entirely of historical significance. This is the one spot where a Native American race has transplanted itself by its natural expansion to Asiatic shores. The circular rim and island-dotted surface have guided Eskimo emigrants to the coast of the Chukchian Peninsula, where they have become partly assimilated in dress and language to the local Chukchas. 562. The same conditions also facilitated the passage of a few Chukchas across Bering Strait to the Alaskan side. At Pak, or Pek, on East Cape and on Diamond Island, situated in the narrowest part of Bering Strait, are the great intercontinental markets of the polar tribes. Here American furs have for many decades been exchanged for the reindeer skins of northern Siberia and Russian goods from faraway Moscow. 563. Only the enclosed character of the sea, reported by the Danish explorer Vitus Bering, tempted the land-bred Russians, who reached the northeastern coast of Siberia at the middle of the 18th century, to launch their leaky boats of unseasoned timber, push across to the American continent, and make this whole Bering Basin a Russian sea. 564. Just as a few decades before, when land exploration of Kamchatka had revealed the enclosed character of the Sea of Okhotsk, the Russian pioneers took a straight course across the water to their Pacific outpost of Petropavlovsk near the southern end of the peninsula. But even before the coming of the Slavs to its shores, the Sea of Okhotsk seems to have been an area of native commercial and ethnic intercourse from the Amur River in Siberia in a half-circle to the east, through Sakhalin, Yizo, the Kuril Islands and southern Kamchatka. 565. Noticeably where the rim of the basin presented the scantiest supply of land and where, therefore, its meager resources had to be eked out by fisheries and trade on the sea. Red Sea Basin. On the southwest margin of Asia, the Red Sea, despite its desert shores, has maintained the influence of its intercontinental location and linked the neighboring elements of Africa and Asia. Identity of climatic conditions on both sides of this long rift valley has facilitated ethnic exchanges, and made it the center of what Ratzel calls the Red Sea group of peoples, related in race and culture. 566. The great ethnic solvent here has been Semitic. Under the spur of Islam, the Arabs by 1514 had made the Red Sea an Arabian and Mohammedan sea. They had their towns or trading stations at Zila on the African side of the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, at Del Aqwa, the port of Abyssinia, at Massawa, Suakin, and other towns, so that this coast too was called Arabia Felix. 567. Assimilation facilitated by ethnic kinship. Vicinal location about an enclosed basin produces more rapidly a unification of race and culture, when some ethnic relationship and affinity already exists among the peoples inhabiting its shores. As in the ancient and medieval Mediterranean, so in the Yellow Sea of Asia, the working of this principle is apparent. The presence along its coasts of divergent but kindred peoples like the Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese allowed these to be easily assimilated to a Yellow Sea race and to absorb quickly any later infusion, like that of the Tatars and Manchus. China, by reason of its larger area, long-drawn coast, massive population, and early civilization, was the dominant factor in this basin. Korea and Japan were its culture colonies, a fact that justifies the phrase calling China the Rome of the Far East. Historical Japan began on the island of Kyusui, facing the Yellow Sea. Like Korea, it derived its writing, its fantastic medical notions, its industrial methods, some features of its government administration, its Buddhism, and its religion of Confucius from the people about the lower Hoangho. 568. 3 centuries ago, Japan had its colony on Korean soil at Fusan, the Calais of the East. 569. For purposes of piracy and smuggling, Japanese penetrated far up the rivers of China. Korea has kept in touch with China by an active trade and diplomatic relations through the centuries. But today China is going to school to Japan. Since Japan renounced her policy of seclusion in 1868 along with her antiquated form of government, and since Korea has been forced out of her hermit life, the potency of vicinal location around this enclosed sea has been suddenly restored. The enforced opening of the treaty ports of Japan, Korea, and China simply prepared the way for this basin to reassert its power to unite, and to unite now more closely and effectively than ever before, under the law of increasing territorial areas. The stimulus was first communicated to the basin from without, from the trading nations of the Occident and that newborn Orient rising from the sea on the California shores. Japan has responded most promptly and most actively to these overseas stimuli, just as England has, of all Europe, felt most strongly the reflex influences from transatlantic lands. The awakening of this basin has started, therefore, from its seaward rim. Its star has risen in the east. It is in the small countries of the world that such stars rise. The compressed energies of Japan, stirred by overseas contact and an improved government at home, have overleaped the old barriers and are following the lines of slight resistance which this land-bound sea affords. Helped by the bonds of geographical conditions and of race, she has begun to convert China and Korea into her culture colonies. The onlooking world feels that the ultimate welfare of China and Korea can be best nurtured by Japan, which will thus pay its old debt to the Middle Kingdom. Chinese expansion seaward. Despite the fact that China's history has always had a decidedly inland character, that its political expansion has been landward, that it has practiced most extensively and successively internal colonization, and that its policy of exclusion has tended to deaden its outlook toward the Pacific, nevertheless China's direct intercourse with the West and its westward directed influence have never, in point of significance, been comparable with that toward the East and South. Here a succession of marginal seas offered easy water paths, dotted with way stations, to their outermost rim in Japan, the Philippines, and remote Australia. About the South China Sea, the Gulf of Siam, the Sulu, Celebes, and Java Seas, the coastal regions of the outlying islands have for centuries received Chinese goods and culture, and a blend of that obstinately assertive Chinese blood. The strength of these influences has decreased with every increase of distance from the indented coasts and teeming, seafaring population of South China, and with every decrease in race affinity. They have left only faint traces on the alien shores of faraway Australia. The divergent ethnic stock of the widespread Malay world has been little susceptible to these influences, which are therefore weak in the remoter islands, but clearly discernible on the coasts of the Philippines, 570 Borneo, the nearer Sunda Islands, and the peninsula of Malacca, where the Chinese have had trading colonies for centuries. 571 But in the eastern half of farther India, which is grouped with China by land as well as by sea, and whose race stock is largely if not purely Mongolian. These influences are very marked, so that the whole continental rim of the South China Sea, from Formosa to the Isthmus of Malacca, is strongly assimilated in race and culture. Tom King, exposed to those modifying influences which characterize all land frontiers, as well as to coastwise intercourse, is in its people and civilization merely a transcript of China. The coast districts and islands of Annam are occupied by Chinese as far as the hills of Cambodia, and the name of Cochin China points to the origin of its predominant population. 1/6 of the inhabitants of Siam are Chinese, some of whom have filtered through the northern border. Bangkok, the capital, has a large Chinese quarter. The whole economic life and no small part of the intellectual life of the eastern face of farther India south to Singapore is centered in the activity of the Chinese. 572. Importance of zonal and continental location. The historical significance of an enclosed sea basin depends upon its zonal location and its position in relation to the surrounding lands. We observe a steady decrease of historical importance from south to north through the connected series of the Yellow, Japan, Okhotsk, Bering Seas and the Arctic Basin, miscalled Ocean. The far northern location of the Baltic, with its long winters of icebound ports and its glaciated lands, retarded its inclusion in the field of history, curtailed its important historical period, and reduced the intensity of its historical life, despite the brave, eager activity of the Hanseatic League. The Mediterranean had the advantage, not only of a more favorable zonal situation, but of a location at the meeting place of three continents and on the line of maritime traffic across the eastern hemisphere from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Thalassic character of the Indian Ocean. These advantages it shares in some degree with the Indian Ocean, which, as Ratzel justly argues, is not a true ocean, at best only half an ocean. North of the equator, where it is narrowed and enclosed like an inland sea, it loses the hygrospheric and atmospheric characteristics of a genuine ocean. Currents and winds are disorganized by the close-hugging lands. Here the steady northeast trade wind is replaced by the alternating air currents of the northeast and southwest monsoons, which at a very early date 573 enabled merchant vessels to break away from their previous slow, coastwise path, and to strike a straight course on their voyage between Arabia or the east coast of Africa and India. 574 Moreover, this northern half of the Indian Ocean looks like a larger Mediterranean with its southern coast removed. It has the same east and west series of peninsulas harboring differentiated nationalities, the same northward running recesses, but all on a larger scale. It has linked together the history of Asia and Africa, and by the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, it has drawn Europe and the Mediterranean into its sphere of influence. At the western corner of the Indian Ocean, a Semitic people, the Arabs of Oman and Yemen, here first developed brilliant maritime activity, like their Phoenician kinsmen of the Lebanon seaboard. Similar geographic conditions in their homelands and a nearly similar intercontinental location combined to make them the middlemen of three continents. Just as the Phoenicians, by way of the Mediterranean, reached and roused slumberous North Africa into historical activity and became the medium for the distribution of Egypt's culture, so these Semites of the Arabian shores knocked at the long-closed doors of East Africa facing on the Indian Basin, and drew this region into the history of southern Asia. Thus the Africa of the enclosed seas was awakened to some measure of historical life, while the Africa of the wide Atlantic slept on. The sea route to the Orient. From the dawn of history, the northern Indian Ocean was a thoroughfare. Alexander the Great's rediscovery of the old sea route to the Orient sounds like a modern event in relation to the Grey Ages behind it. Along this thoroughfare, Indian colonists, traders, and priests carried the elements of Indian civilization to the easternmost sundials, and Oriental wares, sciences, and religions moved westward to the margin of Europe and Africa. The Indian Ocean produced a civilization of its own, with which it colored a vast semicircle of land reaching from Java to Abyssinia, and more faintly, owing to the wider divergence of race, the further stretch from Abyssinia to Mozambique. Thus the northern Indian Ocean, owing to its form, its location in the angle between Asia and Africa and the latitude where, round the whole earth, the zone of greatest historical density begins, and especially its location just southeast of the Mediterranean is the eastern extension of that maritime track of ancient and modern times between Europe and China, has been involved in a long series of historical events. From the historical standpoint, prior to 1492 it takes a far higher place than the Atlantic and Pacific, owing to its nature as an enclosed sea. 575 But like all such basins, this northern Indian Ocean attained its zenith of historical importance in early times. In the 16th century it suffered a partial eclipse, which passed only with the opening of the Suez Canal. During this interval, however, the Portuguese, Dutch and English had rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered this basin on its open or oceanic side. By their trading stations, which soon traced the outlines of its coasts from Sofala in South Africa around to Java, they made this ocean an alcove of the Atlantic, and embodied its events in the Atlantic period of history. It is this open or oceanic side which differentiates the Indian Ocean physically, and therefore historically, from a genuine enclosed sea. Limitation of small area in enclosed seas. The limitation of every enclosed or marginal sea lies in its small area and in the relatively restricted circle of its bordering lands. Only small peninsulas and islands can break its surface, and short stretches of coast combine to form its shores. It affords, therefore, only limited territories as goals for expansion, restricted resources and populations to furnish the supply and demand of trade. What lands could the Mediterranean present to the colonial outlook of the Greeks comparable to the North America of the expanding English or the Brazil of the Portuguese? Yet the Mediterranean as a colonial field had great advantages in point of size over the Baltic, which is only 1/6 as large, 2,509,500 and 431,000 square kilometers respectively, and especially over the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, whose effective areas were greatly reduced by the aridity of their surrounding lands. But the precocious development and early cessation of growth marking all Mediterranean national life have given to this basin a variegated history, and in every period and every geographical region of it, from ancient Phoenicia to modern Spain and Italy, the early exhaustion of resources and dwarfing of political ideals which characterize most small areas become increasingly conspicuous. The history of Sweden, Denmark, and the Hansa towns in the Baltic tells the same story, the story of a hothouse plant, forced in germination and growth, then stifled in the close air. Successive maritime periods in history. Growth demands space. Therefore, the progress of history has been attended by an advance from smaller to larger marine areas, with a constant increase in those manifold relations between peoples and lands which the water is able to establish. Every great epoch of history has had its own sea, and every succeeding epoch has enlarged its maritime field. The Greek had the Aegean, the Roman the whole Mediterranean, to which the Middle Ages made an addition in the North Sea and Baltic. The modern period has had the Atlantic, and the 20th century is now entering upon the final epoch of the world ocean. The gradual inclusion of this world ocean in the widened scope of history has been due to the expansion of European peoples, who, for the past 20 centuries, have been the most far-reaching agents in the making of universal history. Owing to the location and structure of their continent, they have always found the larger outlet in a western sea. In the south the field widened from the Phoenician Sea to the Aegean, then to the Mediterranean, onto the Atlantic, and across it to its western shores. In the north it moved from the quiet Baltic to the tide-swept North Sea and across the North Atlantic. Only the South Atlantic brought European ships to the great world highway of the South Seas, and gave them the choice of an eastern or western route to the Pacific. Every new voyage in the age of discovery expanded the historical horizon, and every improvement in the technique of navigation has helped to eliminate distance and reduced intercourse on the world ocean to the timescale of the ancient Mediterranean. It would be a mistake, however, to suppose that the larger oceanic horizon has meant a corresponding increase in the relative content and importance of history for the known world of each period. Such an intense, concentrated national life as occurred in those little Mediterranean countries in ancient times is not duplicated now, unless we find a parallel in Japan's recent career in the Yellow Sea basin. There was something as cosmic in the colonial ventures of the Greeks to the windswept shores of the Crimea or barbarous wilds of Massilia, as in the establishment of English settlements on the brimming rivers of Virginia or the torrid coast of Malacca. Alexander's conquest of the Asiatic rim of the Mediterranean and Rome's political unification of the basin had a significance for ancient times comparable with the Russification of Northern Asia and the establishment of the British Empire for our day. The ocean has always performed one function in the evolution of history: it has provided the outlet for the exercise of redundant national powers. The abundance of opportunity which it presents to these disengaged energies depends upon the size, location, and other geographic conditions of the bordering lands. These opportunities are limited in an enclosed basin, larger in the oceans, and largest in the northern halves of the oceans, owing to the widening of all landmasses towards the north and the consequent contraction of the oceans and seas in the same latitudes. Contrasted historical Roth-Baltic plate fells of northern and southern hemispheres. A result of this grouping is the abundance of land in the northern hemisphere, and the vast predominance of water in the southern, by reason of which these two hemispheres have each assumed a distinct role in history. The northern hemisphere offers the largest advantages for the habitation of man, and significantly enough, contains a population 5 times that of the southern hemisphere. The latter, on the other hand, with its vast, unbroken water areas, has been the great oceanic highway for circumundane exploration and trade. This great water girdle of the South Seas had to be discovered before the spherical form of the Earth could be proven. In the wide territory of the Northern Hemisphere, civilization has experienced an uninterrupted development, first in the Old World, because this offered in its large area north of the equator the fundamental conditions for rapid evolution. Then it was transplanted with greatest success to North America. The Northern Hemisphere contains, therefore, the zone of greatest historical density, from which the track of the South Seas is inconveniently remote. Hence we find in recent decades a reversion to the old east-west path along the southern rim of Eurasia, now perfected by the Suez Canal, and to be extended in the near future around the world by the union of the Pacific with the Caribbean Sea at Panama, so that finally the Northern Hemisphere will have its own circumundane waterway, along the line of greatest intercontinental intercourse. Size of the oceans. The size of the ocean as a whole is so enormous, and yet its various subdivisions are so uniform in their physical aspect, that their differences of size produce less conspicuous historical effects than their diversity of area would lead one to expect. A voyage across the 177,000 square miles, 453,500 square kilometers, of the Black Sea does not differ materially from one across the 979,000 square miles, 2,509,500 square kilometers, of the Mediterranean, or a voyage across the 213,000 square miles, 547,600 square kilometers, of the North Sea, from one across the 300-fold larger area of the Pacific. The ocean does not, like the land, where upon its surface the evidences and effects of its size, it wraps itself in the same garment of blue waves or sullen swell, wherever it appears, but the outward cloak of the land varies from zone to zone. The significant anthropo-geographical influence of the size of the oceans, as opposed to that of the smaller seas, comes from the larger circle of lands which the former open to maritime enterprise. For primitive navigation, when the sailor crept from headland to headland and from island to island, the small enclosed basin with its close-hugging shores did indeed offer the best conditions. Today, only the great tonnage of ocean-going vessels may reflect in some degree the vast areas they traverse between continent and continent. Coasting craft and ships designed for local traffic in enclosed seas are in general smaller, as in the Baltic, though the enormous commerce of the Great Lakes, which constitute in effect an inland sea, demands immense vessels. Neutrality of the seas, its evolution. The vast size of the oceans has been the basis of their neutrality. The neutrality of the seas is a recent idea in political history. The principle arose in connection with the oceans, and from them was extended to the smaller basins, which previously tended to be regarded as private political domains. Their limited area, which enabled them to be compassed, enabled them also to be appropriated, controlled, and policed. The Greek excluded the Phoenician from the Aegean and made it an Hellenic sea. Carthage and Tarentum tried to draw the deadline for Roman merchantmen at the Licinian Cape, the doorway into the Ionian Sea, and thereby involved themselves in the famous Punic Wars. The whole Mediterranean became a Roman sea, the Mare Nostrum. Pompey's fleet was able to police it effectively and to exterminate the pirates in a few months, as Cicero tells us in his oration for the Manilian Law. Venice, by the conquest of the Dalmatian pirates in 991, prepared to make herself Dominatrix Adriaticae Maris, as she was later called. By the 13th century she had secured full command of the sea, spoke of it as the Gulf, in her desire to stamp it as a mare clausum, maintained in it a powerful patrol fleet under a Capitan in Golfo, whose duty it was to police the sea for pirates and to seize all ships laden with contraband goods. She claimed and enforced the right of search of foreign vessels, and compelled them to discharge 2/3 of their cargo at Venice, which thus became the clearing-house of the whole Adriatic. She even appealed to the Pope for confirmation of her dominion over the sea. 576 Sweden and Denmark strove for a Dominum Maris Balticae, but the Hansa towns of northern Germany secured the maritime supremacy in the basin, kept a toll gate at its entrance, and levied toll or excluded merchant ships at their pleasure, a right which after the fall of the Hanseatic power was assumed by Denmark and maintained till 1857. The narrow seas over which England claimed sovereignty from 1299 to 1805, and on which she exacted a salute from every foreign vessel, included the North Sea as far as Stadland Cape in Norway, the English Channel, and the Bay of Biscay down to Cape Finisterre in northern Spain. 577. At the beginning of the 16th century, the Indian Ocean was a Portuguese sea. Spain was trying to monopolize the Caribbean and even the Pacific Ocean. But the immense areas of these pelagic fields of enterprise, and the rapid intrusion into them of other colonial powers soon rendered obsolete in practice the principle of the mare clausum, and introduced that of the mare liberum. The political theory of the freedom of the seas seems to have needed vigorous support even toward the end of the 17th century. At this time we find writers like Salmasius and Hugo Grotius invoking it to combat Portuguese monopoly of the Indian Ocean as a mare clausum. Grotius in a lengthy dissertation upholds the thesis that Jurgentium quibusvis ed quasvis liberum esse navigationem, and supports it by an elaborate argument and quotations from the ancient poets, philosophers, orators and historians. 578 This principle was not finally acknowledged by England as applicable to the narrow seas till 1805. Now, by international agreement, political domain extends only to 1 marine league from shore or within cannon range. The rest of the vast water area remains the unobstructed highway of the world. Notes to Chapter 9. 528, S. M. Zwiemer, Arabia the Cradle of Islam, page 135. New York, 1900. 529, A. H. Layard, Nineveh and Its Remains, Volume 1, page 277, Volume 2, 79-81. New York, 1849. 530, E. F. Knight, Where Three Empires Meet, pages 257, 261. London, 1897. 531, Colonel Lane Fox, Early Modes of Navigation, Journal of Anthropo-Geographical Institute, Volume 4, page 423. 532, Boyd Alexander, From the Niger to the Nile, Volume 1, page 167. London, 1907. 533, Ibid, Volume 1, page 324. 534, James H. Breasted, History of Egypt, pages 89, 91, 97. New York, 1905. Colonel Lane Fox, Early Modes of Navigation, Journal of Anthropo-Geographical Institute, Volume 4, pages 414 to 417. 535, G. Schweinfurth, The Heart of Africa, Volume 1, page 77. London, 1873. 536, E. Huntington, The Depression of Sistan in Eastern Persia, Bulletin of the American Geographical Society, Volume 37, No. 5. 1905, 537. Schoolcraft, The Indian Tribes of the United States, Volume 1, page 214. Philadelphia, 1853. 538, H. H. Bancroft, The Native Races, Volume 1, pages 382 to 383, 408, 564. San Francisco, 1886. D. G. Brinton, The American Race, pages 110, 112. Philadelphia, 1901. 539, Herodotus, Book 1, Chapter 194. 540, S. M. Zwiemer, Arabia the Cradle of Islam, page 135. New York, 1900. 541, Cotterill and Little, Ships and Sailors, pages 9x, 38, London, 1868. 542, M. Hugh, Travels in Tartary, Thibet and China in 1846, Volume 2, page 251. Chicago, 1898. 543, Elliott Cowes, History of the Lewis and Clark Expedition, Volume 1, page 159. New York, 1893. 544, Colonel Lane Fox, Early Modes of Navigation, Journal of Anthropo-Geographical Institute, Volume 4, pages 423 to 425. 545, H. M. Stanley, Through the Dark Continent, Volume 1, pages 313 to 314. New York, 1879. 546, Ibid, Volume 2, pages 184, 219 to 220, 270 to 272, 300. 547, Ratzel, History of Mankind, Volume 2, page 288. London, 1896 to 1898. 548, Ibid, Volume 1, pages 358 to 359. Spencer and Gillen, Northern Tribes of Central Australia, pages 679 to 680. London, 1904. 549, Ratzel, History of Mankind, Volume 1, pages 153 to 154, Volume 2, pages 91, 100. London, 1896 to 1898. 550, Ibid, Volume 1, pages 166 to 170. 551, Captain Winkler, Sea Charts formerly used in the Marshall Islands, Smithsonian Report for 1899, translated from the Marine Runshaw. Berlin, 1898. 552, Captain James Cook, Journal of First Voyage Round the World, pages 70, 105, 119, 221, 230. Edited by W. J. L. Wharton. London, 1893. 553, Ratzel, History of Mankind, Volume 1, pages 161, 174. London, 1896 to 1898. 554, The Commercial and Fiscal Policy of the Venetian Republic, Edinburgh Review, Volume 200, pages 352 to 353. 1904, 555. H. Helmholtz, History of the World, Volume 1, pages 188 to 189, 193 to 195. New York, 1902 to 1906. 556, G. Sergi, The Mediterranean Race, pages 29 to 37. New York, 1901. W. Z. Ripley, Races of Europe, pages 128 to 130, 270 to 273, 387 to 390, 407, 444, 448. New York, 1899. 557, H. J. Mackinder, Britain and the British Seas, pages 189 to 190. London, 1904. 558, Sitte-Wagner Schalatlas, Volker und Sprachenkarten, No. 13. Gotha, 1905. A Leroy Beaulieu, The Empire of the Tsars, map page 80. New York, 1897. 559, Helmholtz, History of the World, Volume 6, pages 5 to 17. New York, 1902 to 1906. 560, E.C. Semple, The Development of the Hansa Towns in Relation to Their Geographical Environment, Bulletin American Geographical Society, Volume 31, No. 3, 1899. 561, Helen Zimmern, The Hansa Towns, pages 24 to 25, 54 to 55. New York, 1895. 562, Nordenskiold, The Voyage of the Vega, pages 365, 588, 591. New York, 1882. 563, Ibid, pages 375, 403, 405, 487, 563. 564 Ischegnislot, The Vikings of the Pacific, pages 62 to 105. New York, 1905. 565, Ratzel, History of Mankind, Volume 3, pages 446, 449 to 450. London, 1896 to 1898. 566, Ibid, Volume 3, pages 180 to 195. 567, Duarte Barbosa, The Coasts of East Africa and Malabar, pages 17 to 18. Hakluyt Society Publications. London, 1866. 568, Ratzel, History of Mankind, Volume 3, pages 443 to 444. London, 1896 to 1898. 569, Angus Hamilton, Korea, pages 130 to 135. New York, 1904. 570, Census of the Philippine Islands, Volume 1, pages 318 to 320, 478, 481 to 495. Washington, 1903. 571, Hans Helmholtz, History of the World, Volume 2, pages 544 to 545. New York, 1902 to 1906. 572, Ratzel, History of Mankind, Volume 3, pages 407 to 412. London, 1896 to 1898. 573, Pliny, Natural History, Book 6, Chapter 26. 574, Bunbury, History of Ancient Geography, Volume 2, pages 351, 417 to 418, 470, 471. London, 1883. 575. For full discussion of Indian Ocean, see Helmholtz, History of the World, Volume 2, pages 580 to 584, 602 to 610. New York, 1902 to 1906. Duarte Barbosa, The Coasts of East Africa and Malabar, pages 26 to 28, 41 to 42, 59 to 60, 67, 75, 79 to 80, 83, 166, 170, 174, 179, 184, 191 to 194, Hakluyt Society. London, 1866. 576, Pompeo Molmenti, Venice in the Middle Ages, Volume 1, pages 117, 121 to 123, 130. Chicago, 1906. The Commercial and Fiscal Policy of the Venetian Republic, Edinburgh Review, Volume 200, pages 341 to 344, 347. 1904, 577. H. J. Mackinder, Britain and the British Seas, page 24, note. London, 1904. 578, Hugonis Grotiae, Mer liberum civ de jure quod batavus competi ad indicana commercia dissertatio, contained in his De jure belli iti paces. Hagi Comitis, 1680.